This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors and scholars about the books and research and other things that we like and find interesting. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that we like to call Israel Behind the Headlines, delving deep into and unpacking issues underlying our lives here in Israel. My guest today is an author and anthropologist at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Her book, Generations of Hope, Tradition and Intergenerational Transferal Among Ethiopian Immigrants, came out in Hebrew in 2020, and a version of it is forthcoming in English by Springer's Children's Wellbeing series. Dr. Naomi Shmuel, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello.
So maybe we can start by talking about the main features that make the Ethiopian immigration stand apart from other types of aliyah to Israel, and perhaps even immigration more broadly.
Okay, well, I think that all immigrants struggle in the beginning and have many issues to deal with. I think maybe with the Ethiopian immigration, there are a number of factors that make it quite unique. One is the way they got here, the various ways that they arrived in Israel, and the very impressive journey that many of them made on foot from Ethiopia to Sudan in order to reach Israel. There are many factors, many changes that happen at the same time, very suddenly in the transition. And I would say that really part of the perhaps most difficult part of immigration is how the immigrants are received by the host country or the host society. And that there is this human tendency, I think this is not just in Israel, this is all over the world, that when we encounter difference, we tend to sort of judge it. And I think maybe this is one of the things that is most difficult to cope with, is when people's culture is undervalued or not respected enough.
But also in the Israeli context, there's some sort of an expectation that an Oleh would shed his or her previous culture and blend into the Israeli culture, right? Because we're all Jews, this is the Jewish state, we should all be more or less the same.
Yeah, well, this is the melting pot theory, which sort of governed the absorption of immigrants in the 50s and the 60s and was not very successful, and left a lot of immigrants, especially from North Africa and from Arab countries, feeling that they were not appreciated, their culture was not appreciated or respected. It's very complex. Very complex.
So is it different in the Ethiopian case now that, after the demise of the melting pot theory? Because we're basically talking about two separate levels here, right? The state level and the society level, right? How well they are being welcomed and absorbed.
Yes, and I think it's very difficult to make generalizations about this and blanket statements because, if you want to look for examples of success stories, you can find them. And if you want to look for examples of tragic stories, you can find them. So I don't think you can sort of make a headline of failure or success in this instance. I think that like many things in life, this is very complex.
What about the fact that, despite their commitment to, as Jews, to come to Israel to make Aliyah, after all, it's, not since the 50s and even not really then, there was a case of a community coming from a developing country into a developed Israel, right? In the 50s and 60s, Israel wasn't really a developed country, not nearly as much as it is today. So going back to the comparison, the Ethiopian immigration is much more classic in the sense that you see much more of it in the West, right? African people coming to a Western developed country, which in Israel is pretty rare. Was this a factor also in their experience?
I think it's definitely a factor, but it's a two-sided factor. It's a factor on the one hand because there is this sort of inherent as part of Western culture, including Israeli culture, is to undervalue whatever comes from Africa, whatever is black, possibly. And the other side of it is also that it's a very, very big change to come from a collectivistic society, a hierarchical society, very different in many ways, to coming to democratic, aspiring to be egalitarian. I think these are sort of underlying things that make a big difference.
Yeah, and this is really the crux of the issue here. If we look at really tradition and transferal, it's really about these classic or maybe the original structures that and conceptions that they brought along with them as a community into this country, and how these structures withstood the experience of immigration and life in Israel.
Well, I think you have to understand, first of all, that the community itself, as it existed in Ethiopia, which was a very supportive community, where a lot of mutual responsibility, children growing up not only in their families, but in, like the saying, it takes a whole village to raise a child, wasn't a saying in Ethiopia. It was actually true. And I think the change from that to what happens in Israel, where the community as an extensive support network does not exist in the same way. The leaders of the community, the traditional leaders, don't have the same authority here that they had there. The family, there are very, very many changes taking place in the family, in the structure of the family and the way the children are raised, that make a very big difference in the issue of cultural transferal and in every issue in people's lives. And I'll just mention two that I think are very important. One is the whole issue of communication in the family, which there is a lot of, basically a very serious sort of breakdown in communication within the family, which is a combination of the issue of changing languages, and also a fact that in Ethiopia not only was there spoken language, but the non-spoken language, which exists in every culture, but in Ethiopia, I think the non-spoken language of facial expressions and body language was very, very important and central to communication, and it doesn't seem to work here, which is interesting because it's not a verbal language, and that's a whole big issue that one could talk about. That's something that came out of my research.
Is it because the younger generation have lost the ability to read these codes?
Exactly. It's because the younger generation don't understand the signs and signals that they're being given.
Can you give an example of a message that would
of course.
be put across in a non-verbal manner?
Yeah, so when people talk about their childhood in Ethiopia, they would say to me that when I asked them, how did you know what you were supposed to do? And they would say, from my father's eyes, or from my mother's expression, or they would read the body language, and this is how they knew if they were expected to get up and leave, or if they were expected to go and get something. And it doesn't work here. They don't get the message like that. And part of the reason for this is the other thing that I think is really changing what's happening in the families, and especially relevant in the issue of cultural transferal. And this is that in Ethiopia, children and adults spent a lot of time together, because I'm talking about the Ethiopian villages more than the towns. But the children were like apprentices in the adult world. The boys went with their fathers, the girls went with their mothers to do whatever needed doing. And because they spent a lot of time together, they learnt a lot of things from their parents. And they were very connected to their parents' world. And one of the things that happens in Israel is that the worlds of the adults and the parents are completely separated. The children go to kindergarten and school from a very young age, and the parents are busy trying to make a living and often working more than one job, and often manual labor, and often long hours or shift work. So there is a sort of split in the worlds, and this makes it very difficult to maintain the sort of communication that existed in Ethiopia.
And so these are the tensions that have arisen following the immigration. Are there any sorts of customs and structures that remained more or less intact and that are really unique to the Ethiopian community?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that are passed on, even though sometimes it doesn't seem like it. But the interesting thing is that if you speak to the older generation, what is important to them are the values and morality and of the community, of the culture. Whereas if you speak to younger people, so they will immediately talk about the more superficial elements of the culture, like the food and the music and things like that. But really the values of respecting elders and mutual responsibility, helping each other, family cohesion, family and group cohesion, these are the values that the older people really would like to pass on.
And are still looked favorably by the younger generation? Is it still something that they see as part of their heritage?
It's very, very complicated, because on the one hand, I think it's very important for the younger generation to know their cultural roots and to have this connection with the elders in the community, because this is what gives them the resilience to cope with what happens when they go out into Israeli society, and it gives them an identity which has content, so that when even children who are born in Israel who have a sort of birthright to feel Israeli are labeled as Ethiopian because of their color. So if they have this cultural knowledge, this acts as a sort of buffer to prevent this from sort of pushing them out. And
are the younger Ethiopian Israelis, do they also have this function of being mediators for the elderly, cultural mediators with the broader Israeli society?
Well, actually, in my research, there are really three groups that one can identify from the point of view of generations. There's like the older generation who came to Israel over the age of 21 and are really very rooted in the Ethiopian culture. And then there's the younger generation who were born in Israel or came as infants. And the group that are actually act as mediators, as you put it, are really the 1.5 generation. And they're the people who came to Israel over the age of 8 and under the age of 21. So a very significant part of their childhood was in Ethiopia, so they have a very good base in Ethiopian culture. And on the other hand, their teenage years were here in Israel, so they also have a very good understanding of Israeli culture. And they are the ones who often act as a bridge, or even describe themselves as a bridge between the other two groups, between the older community and the youngsters.
Is it a sizable group in the...
Oh, definitely, definitely. And you can also, a lot of the people whom you see as very successful or public figures are often from the 1.5 generation.
So let's talk a bit about the methodology of your research. It was, as often is done in anthropology,
qualitative ethnographic interviews.
Exactly.
I ought to say that I did my doctorate in the Department of Folklore at the Hebrew University and not anthropology.
Right, okay. So how did you, there were several dozen families and individuals that you interviewed. How did you get to them? How was, can you trace the process of finding them?
Sure, I interviewed 50 people from 13 different families who come from all different age ranges and levels of education and backgrounds. Most of them from the Amhara community. And my original idea was to interview in each family like 3 generations, but it was very difficult to get an agreement in advance that I would actually be able to interview the 3 generations. And what I ended up by doing is just interviewing anybody from the family who was willing to talk to me. And so in each family, it's a different combination of relatives. Sometimes it is 3 generations, and sometimes it's more, like cousins, brothers, siblings, or it could be uncles and aunts, or various combinations of relatives.
Was it hard? Were they forthcoming?
Well, I spoke to the people who wanted to speak to me. A lot of people felt it very important to talk about these issues. Generally, the first person in the family whom I interviewed, who was either somebody that was introduced to me by somebody, or I met by chance somewhere, or some distant relative or something. So they introduced me to other members of their family. There were always people who didn't want to be interviewed, and luckily there were also people who did. Mm-hmm. It was often the older generation who needed a bit of persuading by the 1.5 generation in order to participate, which also says something about their position here and how they feel sort of marginalized, because like in Ethiopia, they were the heads of the families, and here they feel their place has been taken by the younger people.
So were the stories across the board pretty much similar, or did they vary greatly?
I think one of the most important things to realize is that there is no such thing as a typical Ethiopian family or a typical immigration experience. I think everything has to be seen in context, and people have very different experiences, families are very different, and we're talking about something which is very, very complicated, and this is why the issue of narrative interviews is so important, because I think it's the only way of really understanding the complex processes that people and families are undergoing after immigration. I don't think it would be possible to understand it by just giving them a questionnaire or something, and I can give 2 examples on that. One is the whole issue of identity, for instance. You can't just tick a box off and this is your identity. People's identities are very, very complicated. The way they see them, it varies very much depending on individual and group experiences. So I think it's one of the interesting chapters in the book, is the whole issue of identity. The other example I wanted to give was, because I use the term in the book cultural flexibility. And I talk about culturally flexible families. And again, this is something that one has to understand the concept and then realize that it's not a blanket term you can apply, because people are sometimes some members of the family are more flexible than others. Sometimes they're flexible about certain things and not everything, or flexible on some days and not flexible on other days. So I think the complexity of life in a family which has undergone immigration and has various experiences of the journey and various experiences of absorption, and today contains at least two cultures, being the culture brought from Ethiopia and the various parts of Israeli culture that come into the home. And this creates a very, very specific situation, which you can only really understand by actually talking to family members and hearing their narratives.
Mm-hmm. Also, getting access to these people, we should say about you personally that you were married to an Ethiopian Israeli and that your children are mixed, are dark-skinned. Did this play any role? Well, I'm sure that it played a role in choosing your the topic of the book, but did it give you some sort of foothold within the community?
I definitely think so, because I think that a lot of people know me because they have my books, and the books have been very important. I'm talking about children's books, which I started to write following my own children's having to cope with the issue of color in preschool and in school, and later discovered that these were the first books in Hebrew which actually included brown-skinned characters. So I think that the fact that people knew who I was, and I had a sort of significance to the community, that helped to get people to talk to me, definitely.
Right. Did any of these features about the experience of immigration, the residues of the Ethiopian tradition brought over to Israel, was any of this present in your household as well? Or is it something that is just for like 100% Ethiopians?
No, I can give some examples of things which I think are important. For example, the main thing is I think that one of the things that impressed me most about the Ethiopian families that I met was the extent of family cohesion. I'm talking about what existed in Ethiopia. I don't know, it changes here a little bit, but or quite a lot. But there, in the culture, the traditional culture, there is this great family cohesion, and I would listen to stories that my children's father would tell stories about how they would share everything and share food, not only actually eat from the same plates and share everything. And I decided that this is what I wanted to adopt for my own children when they were very little. I decided that this is the way to build this family cohesion. So, like I did it with everything. When we had a spare room, then first of all, the children all slept in the same room, and the other room was a toy room. And then with everything, like toys or objects or things that came into the home, they were always everybody's. It wasn't any, this is yours and this is his and all that. Everything was everybody's. And if I gave them like snacks, I would give them in one bowl and not in individual bowls. And this may sound kind of silly, but I think it's really very significant, to the extent that I have 4 boys, and they would also, as soon as they all became teenagers, they would also share clothes, to the extent that when my eldest son moved out of the house, he said to me, and I don't know what clothes to take because everybody wears them. So, but I think they have really a very close, very relationship between them, and I think this is one of the ways of forging it, is this idea that we're all in this together, we're not separated.
But also the experience of immigration is, I wouldn't say universal, but there's many instances of it, including your own, because you were an immigrant yourself. You were right, born in England, came to Israel and then went back to England as a child. Do any of the stories that you heard resemble your experience of immigration?
Definitely. So because I basically made Aliyah twice, once as a child and once after I finished my studies at anthropology at London University, and I was 21 and I came back. I was very sensitive to the experiences of the Ethiopian community I was involved with, especially on this feeling that coming to Israel is coming home, and especially the second time I came, I felt I was coming home and not always being accepted, which I think is probably an experience common to all immigrants. You're not always accepted. I think this is a very powerful experience, that you want to feel at home and you're making every effort to fit in, and yet sometimes you're given the impression that you don't belong. So I would say this is probably, sometimes people ask, what is the hardest thing that immigrants have to cope with? I think that is the hardest thing. Mm-hmm. I don't think anything else is as hard as that. And this is, in many ways, a topic in a lot of my books.
Yeah. And that is independent also of the color of your skin.
It's yes and no, because obviously I experienced it and I'm white. I think the Ethiopians experience it much more because of the color. But not only that, it's also the fact that the younger generation, the generation born in Israel, who one might think would be most Israeli, are also struggling with issues of identity and belonging, because they're also often grouped and labeled as Ethiopian inadvertently, and in all sorts of contexts. So there's that too.
Right. Okay, Dr. Naomi Shmuel, author and anthropologist, author of the recently published Generations of Hope, Tradition and Intergenerational Transferal Among Ethiopian Immigrants. It came out in Hebrew, forthcoming in English. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their partnership and support for this series. And now I have a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind, good, bad, ugly, whatever. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 750 interviews, all free to download. Please like us on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.